The world's energy markets run on a narrow strip of water just 33 kilometers wide. Every day, massive oil tankers glide through it carrying nearly a fifth of the world's oil supply. Now imagine that passage suddenly shutting down. That is the nightmare scenario now gripping global markets after Iran issued a chilling warning. If the United States continues its military pressure, Tehran could move to close the Strait of Hormuz. Within minutes of that statement, oil traders began scrambling. Governments across Europe and Asia called emergency meetings. Shipping companies quietly started reviewing alternative routes. Because if the Strait of Hormuz is blocked, the consequences won't just be regional. They will ripple across the entire global economy. What triggered this moment of panic was a sudden escalation between Washington and Tehran. Reports emerged that the United States had carried out targeted military strikes against Iranian-linked facilities. The strikes were described as limited and strategic, designed to weaken Iran's military infrastructure and send a message of deterrence. But for Iran, the attack crossed a red line. Within hours, Iranian officials warned that if their sovereignty continues to be violated, they would consider all options to defend their interests. And among those options, one stands above all others: disrupting traffic through the Strait of Hormuz. That threat alone was enough to send shockwaves through energy markets. Because the Strait of Hormuz is not just another shipping lane. It is the most important oil transit route on the planet. Nearly 20% of the world's petroleum passes through it every single day. Tankers from Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Kuwait, Iraq, and Qatar all rely on this narrow corridor to reach global markets. For countries like China, India, Japan, and South Korea, Hormuz is a lifeline. Their economies depend on energy shipments flowing through those waters. If that flow stops, even temporarily, the consequences could be immediate and severe. Oil prices would likely surge overnight. Shipping insurance costs would skyrocket. Supply chains already strained by global instability could face another major shock. But to understand why Iran is willing to threaten such a drastic move, you have to step back and look at the long history of tensions surrounding the Strait of Hormuz. For decades, Iran has viewed the strait as its most powerful strategic card. Geographically, Iran sits on the northern coastline of the strait, giving it enormous leverage. Its military has spent years building capabilities designed specifically to control or disrupt maritime traffic in that region. Fast attack boats, anti-ship missiles, naval mines, and drone surveillance networks are all part of a strategy designed to make the strait extremely dangerous for adversaries during a conflict. Iran knows that it cannot compete with the United States Navy in a conventional naval battle, but it doesn't need to. Instead, Iran has developed what military analysts call an asymmetric strategy. Rather than trying to dominate the sea, it focuses on making the strait too risky for large tankers to operate safely. A handful of mines, missile strikes, or coordinated drone attacks could be enough to halt commercial shipping, at least temporarily. And even a short disruption would send global markets into chaos. This strategy has been part of Iran's defense doctrine for years. Iranian leaders have repeatedly warned that if their oil exports are blocked by sanctions or military pressure, then no one else's oil will flow freely either. In other words, if Iran cannot sell its energy, it can threaten the entire system that depends on Gulf oil. That message is designed to force the world to pay attention. But the current crisis did not appear overnight. It is the product of years of mounting pressure between Iran and the United States. The relationship between the two countries has been tense since the Iranian Revolution in 1979, when a pro-Western monarchy was replaced by an Islamic government deeply suspicious of American influence. Since then, disputes over Iran's nuclear program, regional influence, and economic sanctions have repeatedly pushed the two nations to the brink of confrontation. In recent years, those tensions have intensified dramatically. The United States has imposed sweeping sanctions targeting Iran's economy, particularly its oil sector. These measures were designed to cripple Tehran's ability to generate revenue and pressure it into negotiating limits on its nuclear ambitions. For Iran, however, those sanctions have been viewed as economic warfare. And as the pressure increased, so did the risk of retaliation. Now, after the latest U.S. strike, the situation appears to be entering a dangerous new phase. Iran's warning about the Strait of Hormuz is not simply a military threat. It is a strategic signal aimed at multiple audiences at once. First, it is aimed at Washington. By threatening to disrupt the world's most important oil corridor, Iran is essentially saying that any military confrontation will have global consequences, not just regional ones. Second, the message is directed at America's allies, especially in Europe and Asia. Many of these countries rely heavily on Gulf oil. Iran's warning forces them to consider the economic risks of escalating the conflict further. And third, the signal is meant for domestic audiences inside Iran. Demonstrating strength against external pressure has long been a key component of the government's political narrative. But the United States also has its own strategic calculations. For Washington, maintaining freedom of navigation in the Strait of Hormuz is non-negotiable. The U.S. Navy's Fifth Fleet, headquartered in Bahrain, has spent decades patrolling the region to ensure that commercial shipping can move safely through the Gulf. If Iran were to attempt to close the strait, it would almost certainly trigger a swift military response. American naval forces in the region include aircraft carriers, destroyers, submarines, and advanced surveillance systems designed specifically to counter threats to maritime traffic. The United States also coordinates closely with allied navies from the United Kingdom, France, and other partners. In other words, the strait is one of the most heavily monitored waterways on Earth. But that does not mean it is immune to disruption. Even a limited confrontation could create enough uncertainty to halt shipping temporarily. Tanker captains and insurance companies are extremely sensitive to risk. If missile strikes or naval mines become a real possibility, many vessels will simply refuse to enter the area. And that is where the global impact becomes truly serious. If the Strait of Hormuz were blocked or even partially disrupted, oil prices could spike dramatically. Some analysts warn that prices could jump well above $120 per barrel in a worst-case scenario. Such a surge would hit energy-importing economies particularly hard. Countries across Asia would face higher fuel costs. Inflation could rise in major Western economies. And industries that depend heavily on energy, from transportation to manufacturing, would feel immediate pressure. The ripple effects could spread far beyond energy markets. Financial markets tend to react sharply to geopolitical uncertainty. Investors could pull money from risky assets. Global stock markets might experience sudden volatility. Governments might even release strategic oil reserves in an attempt to stabilize prices. And then there is the geopolitical dimension. A crisis in the Strait of Hormuz would force major powers to make difficult decisions. China, the world's largest importer of oil, relies heavily on shipments from the Persian Gulf. Beijing has strong economic ties with Iran, but also deep energy relationships with Gulf Arab states. A disruption in Hormuz would put China in a delicate diplomatic position. India faces a similar dilemma. Its rapidly growing economy depends on stable energy imports, many of which pass through the strait. Meanwhile, European nations, already dealing with energy security challenges in recent years, would be watching the situation closely. Another major supply shock could complicate economic recovery and political stability across the continent. Regional powers in the Middle East would also be directly affected. Countries like Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates depend on exporting oil through the Gulf. While they have invested in alternative pipelines and export routes, the Strait of Hormuz remains their primary gateway to global markets. For them, a prolonged closure would be economically devastating. That is why many analysts believe Iran's threat is more about leverage than immediate action. Closing the strait entirely would be an extremely risky move for Tehran. It would likely provoke overwhelming military retaliation and could isolate Iran diplomatically. But threatening to close it, that is a different story. The threat itself creates uncertainty. It forces global markets to react. It pressures international actors to push for de-escalation. In other words, the warning is part of a broader strategy designed to raise the stakes without necessarily triggering full-scale war. Still, the situation remains highly unpredictable. History shows that crises in the Persian Gulf can escalate quickly. Miscalculations, accidents, or unexpected military encounters can rapidly spiral into larger confrontations. Naval patrols operating in close proximity increase the risk of incidents. Missile tests or drone flights could be misinterpreted. And once tensions reach a certain level, even small events can trigger major consequences. So what happens next? Several scenarios are possible. The first and most hopeful scenario is de-escalation. Diplomatic channels, both public and behind the scenes, could help reduce tensions. International mediators might step in. Military forces could return to a more cautious posture. In that scenario, the crisis might gradually fade from headlines, even if underlying tensions remain unresolved. The second scenario involves a prolonged standoff. Iran continues issuing warnings about the Strait of Hormuz while the United States maintains military pressure. Shipping continues, but under heightened security and constant risk. This kind of tense equilibrium has occurred before in the Gulf, with occasional incidents, but no full closure of the strait. The third and most dangerous scenario would involve direct attempts to disrupt shipping. That could include naval mines, missile strikes, or attacks on tankers. Even limited actions of this kind could force temporary closures and trigger immediate global economic consequences. And if military forces respond aggressively, the confrontation could expand beyond the strait itself. For now, the world is watching carefully. Energy traders are monitoring every statement from Tehran and Washington. Naval forces are increasing surveillance across the Gulf. And governments everywhere are preparing contingency plans in case the situation deteriorates further. Because the Strait of Hormuz is not just a regional choke point. It is a central artery of the global economy. When tensions rise there, the entire world feels it. And that is exactly why Iran's warning has created such widespread panic. In geopolitics, power is not only about armies and weapons. Sometimes it is about geography. About the ability to control the narrow passageways through which the world's resources must flow. The Strait of Hormuz is one of those passageways. Right now, it sits at the center of a dangerous strategic confrontation between two powerful adversaries. And until the tension between them eases, the world will continue to hold its breath, watching that narrow stretch of water and wondering whether it will remain open.